Hey everyone, this is Nick, and if you follow the latest free software and open source news, you might have seen some strong conversations about various open source libraries that, due to lack of funding, kinda caused a lot of problems for a lot of companies that relied on these open source software. Specifically, log4j, colors, and faker are three libraries that have generated a lot of discussion, either because they had vulnerabilities that went unfixed, or because their developer got tired on working on something that didn't generate any revenue despite being used by giant companies all around the world. This begs the question, who needs to pay for free and open source software maintenance and security? And also, who needs anything else than today's sponsor to run their own Linux and gaming servers? Linode is an amazing way to get your Linux server up and running. They've been voted top provider for infrastructure as a service by G2 and TrustRadius, and they offer tons of one-click deployable servers. For example, Owncast, letting you run your own Twitch-like streaming server with video broadcast and chat capabilities, or Apache Guacamole, which is the easiest way to get your own fully featured Linux desktop in the cloud, accessible from anywhere in the world. If you prefer gaming, you can also start your own Valheim server on Linode, and they also have one-click servers available for CSGO, Rust, Ark, or Minecraft, among others. Now, on top of that, Linode is currently upgrading all their data centers with faster NVMe block storage, which means that every server that you currently have with them or that you plan to open with them will have access to that faster storage at no extra cost for you, which is pretty freaking amazing. Now, I personally run my own Nextcloud instance and OnlyOffice document server, both on Linode, and I couldn't be more satisfied. I can only recommend them. So if you want to give them a shot and get started, click the link in the description below and you will get a free $100 credit to start your own Linux server. Let's start with open source and funding. A lot of people assume that open source or free software is free of charge. But while that's generally the case, it's not an obligation. Most FOSS licenses allow their developers to charge for access to the source code or a binary distribution of it. Most developers choose not to charge for their software and generally tend to sell services around their software to try and pay for the development work. Some libraries do have free access to the source code for individuals, but not for companies, although enforcing this and checking that companies do not cheat is virtually impossible. This means that most libraries and open source projects are effectively free of charge for their users and have to rely either on services or on voluntary donations from users and companies. This makes revenue pretty unpredictable and sometimes inexistent, especially for smaller pieces of software meant for servers that are used by developers working for a company and that will have a hard time making their company donate to the project in the first place. It's important to note that the decision to include free and open source software in a company's project generally isn't made by the CEO or even the CTO. It's generally a developer that needs something done quick and reliably, and they just grab a free and open source library and include it in their project. If that developer went to their boss and asked them, "Hey boss, we're going to use this FOSS library, maybe we could donate to it, it's super useful," the answer would probably be, "How about you do what I pay you for and develop something yourself instead?" This ends up with a paradox. User-facing software that has a graphical interface and is used by regular users tends to have easier access to funding than server-side libraries that are used by giant companies that make billions each year, because basic users will part more easily with their cash, $1 at a time, than a company that doesn't really know what they use to make their own stuff work. And this brings us to the second major point of this video. Most of the modern web is underpinned by open source software and libraries. 100% of the world's top 500 supercomputers run on Linux. 96% of the world's top 1 million servers run on Linux. 90% of all cloud infrastructure operates on Linux, and out of the top 25 websites in the world, only 2 don't use Linux. If we go one step further, Android has around 75% worldwide market share, and that's also based on Linux. Yeah, I know, I only say Android is Linux when it suits my own purposes, sue me. Or actually no, don't, because I'm pretty poor as it is. Linux isn't the only open source project underpinning the web. For a long while, the default stack for a server was LAMP, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. All open source projects. It's less true nowadays with tons of new technologies being used to replace these various components, but most of these new technologies are open source as well. With the rise of NPM, the Node Package Manager, it's easier than ever to access hundreds of thousands of libraries for your projects, most of them open source. As usage of this tool developed, more and more components of the modern web are shared between websites and developers, and most of the modern web is now underpinned by open source operating systems, programs, tools, and libraries. Which brings us to this very famous XKCD comic that probably everyone knows. There is no telling how much in terms of percentage of the web is currently unmaintained, vulnerable, or just really not touched at all, because most of it is made by open source developers that work without funding, without guarantee, or without support. Recent issues have showcased all of that. Let's begin with log4j. It's one of the most popular logging libraries used online. It gives software developers a way to build a record of activity to be used for anything from troubleshooting to auditing, data tracking, whatever else. Companies such as Apple, IBM, Oracle, Cisco, Google, and Amazon all run log4j. Well, that's a success story if I ever saw one. Oh yeah, except this library has only received recent contributions from 4 people. And that's probably because there was a huge vulnerability that affected almost the entire web a few months ago. Barring that, there's probably only 1 or 2 people that regularly fix bugs and add stuff to that library. Let that sink in. 1 to 4 people only working on one of the libraries that is used by almost every single server on the web. The vulnerability that was discovered was very severe, letting malicious attackers send a string to the server and use that to basically take control of it. Wow, hacking is easy! The vulnerability was actually disclosed to the log4j team by someone working at Alibaba, a company that has a market cap of about $330 billion. When disclosing this, they added, "Please hurry up," as in hurry up and fix it. So we have a huge company that could have worked on and submitted a patch, but which instead decided to tell the responsible developer to hurry up and fix their crap. Classy! Another recent issue with a different outcome was the very popular libraries Colors and Faker. Colors enables users to get color and style in their Node.js console. It is downloaded over 23 million times per week and has nearly 19,000 projects that depend on it. Faker creates fake, realistic data for testing purposes and is downloaded over 2.4 million times per week and has over 2,500 projects depending on it. So yeah, pretty popular libraries. Except their developer got fed up of having super successful projects that didn't turn in any money and were used by Fortune 500 companies. So one day he decided to push an update that borked the output of both libraries. That update got pushed to all projects from Fortune 500 companies or not, thanks to NPM, and projects that didn't test their stuff before updating got a nice taste of breakage. So we have 2 very different issues. One is a giant company that is just taking open source work for granted and assuming that they're gonna do free maintenance and only are interested in how the library works when there's an issue with it. And the second one is a developer getting fed up by that exact behavior and doing something very stupid in reaction. Both of these issues could have been avoided in a number of ways. First, it would have been easier to spot the issue in log4j had companies that use that library checked on it more thoroughly, or decided to implement a code review process for open source code they want to use, and maybe contribute to improving said code. Second, if companies decided that they wanted to make their own work depend on smaller open source projects, a monetary contribution doesn't seem so crazy. After all, if you had to develop the equivalent software in-house, you would pay a developer to do it. The issue generally seems to be like major big companies tend to think of open source software as a free of charge subcontractor. You can grab their work for free, they'll maintain it for free, they'll update it for free, and sometimes you can even put in a request and they develop it for free. Current open source work is either done by a big company that sells services around it, or by small individual developers that depend on GitHub sponsors and Patreon for funding, which is really unreliable and means that these projects, however popular they are, can't come with any guarantees, maintenance, or evolutive work. The current model of web giants basing their own offerings on the shoulders of unpaid volunteers and expecting all of that to work flawlessly without ever contributing to it with code or money isn't really sustainable. As a project is used by bigger companies, it becomes a target for malicious hackers, and making sure that this code is secure can become a full-time job that no one can expect an unpaid volunteer to do. So what's the solution? Do open source developers need to take responsibility and always maintain their code up to date and always offer security fixes, even though the licenses they use clearly state that this code is provided without any guarantee? Should big companies grow some kind of better work ethic and decide to implement policies where they contribute, review, or donate to the major projects that they use? Or is there a middle ground between the two? The solution isn't obvious. As I said, companies don't really choose as an entity to use open source code and not contribute back. Open source code is used by developers working at these companies to make their own work easier and faster. The legal representatives of the company itself probably have no knowledge of which libraries are actually used and if they are maintained or not. But not knowing doesn't mean that the responsibility to make sure that these libraries are correctly funded and work in case something happens isn't their responsibility as well. It's a very complex topic. It's easy to see the big companies as the bad guys here, taking advantage of the little developers and asking them to do unpaid work. It's also easy to be a bit gatekeepy and say that no real developer would leave their work buggy and vulnerable, and that pride alone demands they fix their code. Both points of view are probably wrong. But what's certain though is that the status quo, the current situation, means that open source software doesn't look very professional, and companies can be reluctant to use open source code after these issues. But it all stems from a stupid misunderstanding of what open source code is. It's just that, it's code. It comes with nothing else but code. We need to make sure that the web stays underpinned by all these open source technologies, because a web where every company redevelops every major building block for a web app, for a website, would be even less safe and would be more chaotic than it already is. But the current situation means that open source work is very unsustainable for a lot of developers, even though their work, their open source work, is used by big companies whose profits majorly depend on that kind of work. Just like you can depend on me to give you a nice segue to this video sponsor, Slimbook. These guys make Linux laptops and desktops from Valencia, Spain, and they're letting you get 150 euros off your own ultrabook, the Slimbook Executive. I reviewed it on the channel, it's a fantastic computer, and with that discount, the price is really unbeatable, so check the link in the description below if you're interested and get your own while the stocks last, because that won't be for long. So thank you everyone for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't hesitate to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, drop a comment, and if you didn't like the video or you disagree with everything, just drop a dislike and tell me why in the comments as well. If you want to help me keep making those videos, you can also join my Patreon subscribers and my YouTube members, and you'll get access to a weekly Patreon cast and the right to vote on the next topics I'll cover. So thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!